But this disdain for public education is troubling. Yes, it is. Political scientist Benjamin Barber has argued, and this is something we must learn if our children are going to learn, that our public schools don't merely serve the public, but they actually create the public. Public schools are not merely schools for the public, but schools of publicness, institutions where we learn what it means to be a public. And we start down the road toward a common national and civic identity. And as a nation, as a state, we need to remind ourselves of the value of public education. The Center on Educational Policy has developed this publication called Why We Still Need Public Schools, and it covers the history of public education and explains how public schools are linked to the common good. You can't have a constitution that says the primary purpose of this nation is to establish justice and to provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare and to ensure domestic tranquility without having strong public schools. In fact, it cites the missions that our country has often expected public education to fill. Schools are there to provide universal access to free education, guarantee equal opportunities for all children, unify a diverse population, prepare people for citizenship in a democratic society, prepare people to become economically self-sufficient, or I would say community sufficient, and then number 3, to improve social conditions. These are noble goals. We have to learn that the very purpose of public education gets distorted and fought when racism is not unpacked and named. And so if we're going to have a conversation about social justice in public education, you cannot in this conference or any other conference find a way around racism. You've got to have a grown-up conversation. You've got to have it. And by racism, I don't mean prejudice. I don't mean whether you like somebody. I'm not talking about David Dukes. I'm not talking about whether somebody puts a robe on. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about systemic planned policies that undermine the ability of us to be a democracy for and of and by all the people. That's what we're talking about. And I'm so glad to see a diverse audience, because the conversation about racism can't just be at a black event, and it can't just be lifted by black people. We need white people and Latinos and Asians to all talk about race. And black people, we have to take on some black people who promote policies that are also racist, but they look like you. Public education is a civil right, a human right. And we can't get caught up too in these, one study talks about competitive programs, talking about which schools are better. In this democracy, particularly in this state where we have a constitutional right to public education, the issue is not about winners and losers. All schools are supposed to be great schools for all children, period. And we can't allow people to look at a school that's resegregated and high poverty and say, well, they still had a valedictorian. Or, well, I know somebody who made it through. I love the analogy my friend, the former dean at the law school at UNC used to tell, he said, you know, I love it because, you know, I used to be a little pool hustler, I thought. You know, and you know how you hustle people pool. Anybody know how to play pool in here? Don't y'all be so ashamed. If the preacher can admit it, let me see, man. None of y'all won't raise your hand. Lord have mercy. Okay, all right. Okay. When you hustle pool, the way you do it is you set up a shot. You know, you set up shots and you play tricks, like tilting the table up at the end. Now, somebody can make that shot, but the problem is that's not how you're supposed to play pool. The table is supposed to be level. So when you suggest, well, this kid graduated from this school, sure, it's resegregating high poverty. Sure, we pulled all the teachers, the high quality teachers out of it. Sure, we did that. But they made it. And everybody else can make it if they just work hard and come from a good family and their parents pray with them. That's hustling. Because the fact of the matter is, they shouldn't have to make the shot with the pool table tilted up. Then nextly, we have to learn, because it's a civil rights issue, we have to learn to deal with this ugly reality. And that is that schools are resegregating in high poverty today faster than they were in the 1970s. 62 years after Brown. There ought to be a lament about that. There ought to be some tears about that. John Cazole wrote The Shame of the Nation in 2005, and listen what he says. He says he connects education to power by contrasting the kind of education given generously to children of privilege with schooling that is made available to poor children in segregated city schools. He says that he believes that much of today's school reform is an exercise in improving separate schools, that the exercise in simply trying to improve separate schools is no more than giving in to the worldview of Plessy versus Ferguson in the 21st century and justifying separate but equal. Resegregation is serious. It's not just about the resegregation of bodies. It never was. The fight for integration wasn't about that if black folks sat beside white people they could learn. It wasn't the point. The point was if you segregate bodies, you segregate budgets. If you segregate budgets, you segregate books. You segregate books, you segregate curriculums. You segregate facilities. Resegregation is also connected to residential segregation. That's why when we simply fund schools based on property tax, it's inherently unequal. Yes, it is. Because then we fund based on wealth and ownership and not the importance of every child. Not only that, we have to begin to talk and learn about the economic value of public education. We have to talk about that. The Economic Policy Institute says that the full potential economic payoff from a major investment in America's children would occur if the achievement gaps were eliminated between American students of different incomes, classes, races, and ethnicities, or even if we just improved it and closed the gap between the average American student and the students in higher performing national education systems. The studies told us as far back as 2005, it's not that we don't know, the society doesn't know this, the issue is will we learn to follow it. A study in 2009 said that they estimated that the closing the achievement gaps between low-income students and others would boost the GDP $70 billion. That if you close the gap between the races and ethnicities, it would boost the GDP by $50 billion. And further, a major investment in America's children also boosted the average performance of American students. Payoff would be even larger. It says if you close the gap between the average student and the higher achieving students, it would boost the GDP by $180 billion. And we have to challenge those who say, yeah, but we don't want to spend any money. Wait a minute. Now, yes, you do. You don't mind spending money because you say things like a bank is too big to fail. You don't mind spending money. You don't mind spending money because you take money from the government and give it back to the wealthy. You don't mind spending money when you want to spend money. But the question is, we have to say, you cannot say you love children and then fight investment in their lives and investment in their teachers and investment in their school. That is hypocrisy. And it is a national moral disgrace. I was talking to my good friend Mary Wright Edelman, and she talks about this in her report, that there are 14 million poor children and 6.5 million extremely poor children. And there are 8 million more poor whites than there are blacks in this country. Not children, but just citizens. We have the world's largest economy. We got 14 million poor children. And that number exceeds the population of 12 states. In other words, you could add up the population of Alaska, Hawaii, Idaho, Maine, Montana, New Hampshire, North Dakota, Rhode Island, South Dakota, Vermont, West Virginia, and Wyoming, or the combined populations of Sweden and Costa Rica. That's how many poor children we have. And we know from a study of the Mailman School of Public Theology in Public Health at Columbia University that more people die from poverty and the lack of public education every year than die from heart attacks, strokes, and cancer. It's a moral disgrace. And the younger children are, the poorer they are during their years of their greatest brain development. We got to learn this is a moral crisis.